I wanted to make sure that you could hear me.
We're perfect. We're perfect.
Wonderful. Sorry for the rocky start.
No problem. No problem. It's our fault. This is like a new experiment for us here. We're using this new webinar software. So,
my friend, 2020 is a new experiment for us.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to pass over to Ruby now because
thank you.
You're like Ruby's like seriously. Ruby's like talking about you every week. It's like I'm like, I don't know who Irshad Manji is yet, but you talked about it for 2 years to me every week. So, like, thank you. Yeah.
That's very kind, very kind. Assalamu alaikum, Ruby.
Salams, Irshad. It's a big welcome to TMRSicons.
Thank you.
Finally speaking to you. Okay.
Yes.
Get into the main stuff. So Irshad, the majority of us here are teachers of religion, and we're looking at ways of diversifying our curriculum. Now, when it comes to the study of Islam, you know that Islam can be portrayed easily as a monolithic religion, and you stand for Reformed Islam. It's a minority voice,
to say the least.
It's something that I think that it'd be really powerful. You can kind of bring that into the curriculum to diversify it beyond the political Sunni and Shia differences. So, just as a starter, could you share your philosophy of Islamic reform? What are the key principles of Islamic reform that drove your life's mission?
Yes, thank you, Ruby. And good morning, everybody from New York. Good afternoon to you throughout the UK. Let me begin this way. There is an important distinction between reform and revolution. Revolution of any kind doesn't take tradition into account. In fact, it seeks to destroy tradition. Reform of any kind seeks to restore what has been lost. And in this case, the most positive of what has been lost. And one of the great traditions within Islam that has been annihilated for political reasons, purely political reasons, is the tradition of ijtihad. Ijtihad. Now I'm going to spell that for all of you. I-J-T-I-H-A-D. Ijtihad. Thank you, Ruby. You've put it in the chat. I realize that this may sound eerily like jihad to many non-Arab ears. And truth be told, it comes from the same root as jihad, to struggle. But unlike any notion of violent jihad, and incidentally, jihad doesn't even mean violence, it's extremists who have given it that connotation. But unlike any connotation of violence, ijtihad is about struggling with the multi-layered complexity of our world. In other words, what God has created is so deliciously pluralistic that we need to move beyond first impressions and exercise our curiosity to understand more. And in doing so, we pay tribute to God's creative power. This brings me to the overall interpretation of Islam that I have both preached and taught to many of my own students based on the exercising of ijtihad. I point out that we Muslims are monotheists. That means we are to worship one God, not God's self-appointed ambassadors, which in turn means that we cannot legitimately, any one of us, go around playing God with one another because we do not have any monopoly on truth as human beings. And what that ultimately means is that it is our spiritual duty to build and contribute to societies in which we can disagree with one another, disagree in peace and with civility, because anything less means that somebody is playing God. And that is the central sin in Islam. So here is the, in my view, lovely paradox. Devotion to one God obliges us to defend human liberty. And right now, that concept is very difficult for many older Muslims to appreciate. But I can tell you, Ruby, and you are a classic example of this, many younger Muslims are catching on. You know what the sad part is, though? Because most in the older generation will not listen to that idea or that interpretation, it is actually being shown now through researchers, including a very good friend of mine, a Turkish researcher by the name of Mustafa Akyol, that Islam as religion is plunging in popularity even within Muslim countries. That in Iran and Turkey, for example, many Muslims are going on record to say, oh, they believe in God, but not in Islam. And I would submit to you that the reason for this is that an older generation of Muslims is not yet letting fresh air, the fresh air of ijtihad, into the house of Islam. So one of two things will happen. Because of that closed-mindedness, they will allow Islam to die. But again, the great paradox here is if they become open-minded, Islam has a chance of thriving, and in the peaceful way that we love to claim it's about.
Yes. Thank you, Irshad, for that. That was brilliant. And for those teachers that are wondering, where does the ideas of Islamic, where could they find the ideas? Irshad's book, Allah, Love and Liberty, is very accessible. And as a young Muslim, I kind of struggled with faith in terms of how would I reconcile my integrity, the things that I deeply believe in or I find to be true, along with my religion. And this is exactly what Irshad Manji's book does. It kind of guides Muslims to do that. And you don't have to take the extreme end of completely rejecting faith entirely. There is space for that. And that's how ijtihad is a Quranic concept, gives you the space to do so. And just a quick question, Irshad, from that, because I know what the immediate objections would be. Is ijtihad an excuse for Muslims to do whatever they like? Is there a fine line between ijtihad and following your whims, your desires and your whims? That would be the first objection, I think, from a lot of.
Of course. And yes, indeed, there is a line between following your whims and exercising ijtihad. One of the points I've made repeatedly, but again, in emotional discussion and debate, often my adversaries fail to hear this, is that a very crucial way in which younger Muslims can exercise ijtihad, rather than capitulating to nihilism, which is what so many militant extremists do, we ought to question the scholars whom we follow. In other words, allow scholars to lead, but don't be afraid to ask questions. And in part of our discussion today, Ruby, we'll cover how to ask questions in a way that does not lead to defensiveness, but instead allows us to express our curiosity and quite possibly even get other scholars thinking about what they may be missing.
That's brilliant, thank you. Just linking back to, for some of the teachers in the audience, I know some of you teach in schools where they are predominantly Muslims, and in the schools you often find in the RE classroom, there's an unwillingness to question religion. I know that when I was younger, I was also that at some point, and I know what it feels like when you're questioned. So I think ijtihad is a beautiful way, is a Quranic way for a lot of Muslims to enter that space. So it doesn't have to be just science or logic or atheism that gets them to question their religion. It is within their own holy scripture that they allowed that space. So thank you for sharing that. Before we do move on to the gutsy global citizenship, is there, obviously, I think a key principle of Islamic reform is progress, is the willingness to change with knowledge or ideas. So you've been on this journey for over 2 decades, calling for Islamic reform. Has anything changed since then? Looking back, would you change anything?
Are you asking if I've witnessed anything changing, or are you asking how I've changed, or perhaps both?
Perhaps both, in terms of ideology. Has it
okay. Well, let me actually begin to answer both of those questions with a quick story. A few years ago, I was teaching at the University of Southern California, and I decided to hold a number of events, starting the titles of which would start with "Forbidden Questions About." And the very first event was Forbidden Questions About Islam. And in these events, I proactively invited the most burning questions that students had, be they Muslim or non-Muslim, the most burning questions that they had about the topic at hand, and in this case, it was Islam. In other words, don't fear being judged for having questions, or even for having your specific question. In this environment, you are safe to do so. And the only thing that will offend me is if you self-censor. Well, I'm happy to tell you, Ruby, and I did not expect this, that after a very, very vibrant conversation during the formal proceedings, 4 hours after the event, I was still in the auditorium engaging with young people on their questions. And the most persistent questioners were young women in hijab. I only point out that they wore hijab because, again, the media stereotype, or indeed even the stereotype within many Muslim communities, is that our religious girls would never cross the line to ask questions about their faith. No, it turns out our religious girls would, because they need to, because they also appreciate that any Islam, or for that matter, any faith that is voluntary, is sincere. Any faith that is coerced is not sincere, and therefore not sustainable, which is why we see Islam, plunging in popularity in many Muslim countries today. All right, so yes, I am seeing change. I'm very, very happy to report that, but there is no but, there's an and. And I think among the reasons that we can see this change happening is that people like me, who have gone out and advocated openly, visibly for reform among Muslims, is that we are not there to have a showdown or a contest with traditionalists. We are there to start conversations, start dialogues, not spark debates. Now, this is very important, because there was a time, Ruby, early on in my advocacy of Muslim reform, that I fortified myself for a fight. Every time I walked onto a stage, I knew I would be denounced and condemned. I literally prayed to Allah, please, please help me rise above the anger. And sometimes I failed to rise above the anger, and I would instantly turn what could have been a discussion into a debate. But after about 10 years of doing that, I told myself, not only am I exhausted by all of the negative energy, but I need to change if I'm going to have a different outcome to these, conversations that would turn into confrontations. And in fact, during the most important discussion of my life as a reform-minded Muslim, it was literally a program titled Head to Head on Al Jazeera International. You remember it. And because it was titled Head to Head, you knew that it was supposed to be a debate. But instead, I made an emotional pact with myself. I said to myself, when your opponent, notice I didn't say enemy, your opponent makes a good point, acknowledge it as a good point. If he asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, say you don't know the answer. Admit that. Be honest. And if you need a few seconds on live television to think about how you're going to respond to something, take the time. Don't be bullied by the awkwardness of the dead air. And in doing all of these things, a number of imams came up to me afterwards during the reception to say, Irshad, I was told that, you are always in combat mode, and I was ready to fight you. But because your defenses were down, mine are too. And please don't tell anybody, said one, but I agree with you. And I don't know how to express that to my own Jamaat, my own congregation, without losing their confidence. The point being, how we communicate any provocative message is at least as important as what we communicate. And I wish I had known that earlier. So I'm passing that all on to you now.
Yeah, and just to take this opportunity, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your journey, taking the bullets, standing up, because by doing so, you've opened the way for millions and millions of people, including me. And so your work really has had a deep impact. And if there's one thing that I've really learned from you, and based on what you're saying, is that faith, sincere faith, is one that it comforts you. It shouldn't make you feel insecure. If you become insecure by questioning, if someone questions you and you become insecure, then that says a lot about your faith. Are you following it because of simply because of is it a matter of uniformity and dogma, or is it a matter of, oh, this is what you truly believe in? So yeah, you've really kind of bring in the integrity in religion, and that's what you stand for. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Yes, I love that word. I think integrity. And I have to say very briefly, that means wholeness. That means wholeness. The integrity of self is, the ability to see ourselves in our multifaceted complexity, just as ijtihad asks us to see our faith and the world that God has created for us in its multifaceted plurality, which means that it takes time and it means struggle with the mind to comprehend. So thank you for the word integrity.
Brilliant. So just moving on to the more gutsy global citizenship, which you've written loads about. So could you tell us, what is moral courage? For those who don't know, what is the moral courage?
Well, let me first say what moral courage has to do with what we've just been talking about, and therefore, even with the understanding of religion. Moral courage means doing the right thing in the face of your fear. What social science repeatedly shows is that we human beings fear one thing over anything else. Can you guess what that might be, Ruby?
Anyone who questions you or your beliefs becoming insecure?
It's related to that. What we human beings fear more than even violence, we fear being judged. And of course, that means judged negatively. So yes, being challenged, being questioned. If you develop and you exercise moral courage, you do the right thing, even though you know you will be judged negatively for doing so. Now, that brings us to the question, what is the right thing? In such a polarized planet as we have right now, one person's right is another person's abominable. So how can we know what the right thing is at any time? And this is where somebody asked in the chat, it would be very helpful if you taught us how to disagree, respectfully and constructively. Doing the right thing, first and foremost, means that instead of assuming you're right, because that's what your ego tells you you are, namely right, and everybody else therefore is wrong, doing the right thing means exposing yourself to different points of view. As a matter of fact, Ruby, you may or may not remember this, but at the very end of my first book about Islamic reform, namely it's called The Trouble with Islam Today, at the very end of that book, I wrote, readers, there you go. I wrote to readers, if you disagree with me about anything that I'm claiming, please write to me and let me know so we can hatch it out. And it's in the process of exposing myself to different points of view that I've come to appreciate. I don't have all the truth, but neither does somebody else. And that one of the things as educators we need to realize is that while facts have truth to them, facts don't convey meaning. They do not bestow meaning. It's the interpretation of facts that are the source of meaning. And interpretation is not always, in fact, it's very rarely just true or just false, which is why we need to open ourselves up to different points of view so that we can clarify for ourselves. Why do I believe what I believe? Should I believe it? If I had the experiences of somebody who does disagree with me, would I perhaps also be disagreeing with myself? All of this leads us to advocate a position or an interpretation with humility. And it's in having humility, in asking questions about where other people are coming from, particularly those who disagree with us, asking them questions about why they have come to the conclusion they have, what experiences they've had that lead them to that conclusion, and in listening sincerely to these questions. And they're not gotcha questions, they're genuine questions born of curiosity. In doing that, we respect the other. Respect, by the way, comes from the word respectate, to look again. It means going past the first impression, to dig deeper and to engage. And just as what happened with the debate on Al Jazeera, by showing respect to those who disagreed with me, I was able to get their emotional defenses down, which meant that they didn't always have to worry about how am I going to get Irshad on this? How am I going to jab her with this point? Or how am I going to win that point? They were able to clear their minds and then also hear where I was coming from. So to have moral courage, particularly in such a polarized time as we live in, is in fact to listen to understand rather than listening to win. And if we as educators can teach our own students how they can do the same, even as they are discussing religion, I dare say that we would be building a citizenry that is less attracted to dogma than it is attracted to the trust that is known as faith.
Brilliant. I think what your point really talks about is the importance of having dialogue as opposed to debate. And I know that in a lot of schools, especially in RS, it's very easy to have a debate of for and against. And it's very easy to polarize viewpoints. And that often begins within the classroom.
Yeah.
I think it's important that in the classroom, we talk about having a dialogue and the sincerity around it. And the importance of how just asking questions for the sake of learning as opposed to defending oneself.
That's right.
So thank you so much for highlighting that. And I think a lot of teachers will respect that. So we've talked about moral courage now, and in theory, it sounds amazing. You know, I can speak to a bunch of pupils and students, but how can we actually enact it? How can teachers show moral courage? How can they encourage pupils to be moral courage?
Yes, great question. You know, many of the attendees today may know, but for those who don't, I'm actually Canadian, though I live and teach in the United States. And I bring this up because many years ago, when I was still on tour advocating reform among Muslims, I would come to the customs officers on either side of the border. And they would ask me, what do I do for a living? I said, I'm an educator. They would ask me, what do I teach? And, you know, you don't mess with people in uniforms, right? So I would be very open to them. I would say to them, I teach how to advocate for and achieve reform within my faith of Islam. And a number of them, interestingly, rather than zeroing in on the word Islam, would say, oh, so you're teaching leadership. Exactly right. I would say, thank you, you know, for seeing that. And then they would say, no word of exaggeration, they would say, oh, but that can't be taught. And I would say to them, sir, it always was, sir, it's true that you cannot teach somebody to be intrinsically motivated to lead. You cannot. You know, they have that spark about wanting to lead or they don't. That's true. But when they do have that spark, you can actually support them with skills, the skills of, and I would always say, morally courageous leadership. At which point we were taking far too much time in our tete-a-tete, and they would say, okay, here you go, away with you. So the skills that I'm talking about are skills such as listening to win, listening to understand, not to win. I know you would have caught me on that because you're listening. The skill to continue asking questions, sincere questions, not based on some preconceived agenda that you have brought to the conversation, but rather based on what you just have heard already from the person who disagrees with you. And the skill also to take a deep breath when you have heard something from them that triggers you. It's amazing, but you know, so much of the reason that we turn discussions into destructive debates is that we are biologically wired to scan for threats. And our wiring tells us the moment you feel threatened, you either freeze, fight, or flee. And in a discussion that becomes a debate, we normally fight back. But that only makes a situation worse. So simply the act of taking a breath before responding, before asking your next question, gives your brain the time to go from engaging the primal part of the brain, which is the brain where the ego is, allows you the time to skip that over and tap into the evolved part of the brain, where reason and emotion can coexist, rather than emotion bulldozing reason. I point this out. I go into this kind of neurobiological, explanation, because everybody needs to know that reacting is natural. Therefore, exercising moral courage within particularly tough conversations has to be intentional. We have to make it a habit, which is why we need to role model those skills with our own students and help them learn those skills as well as practice those skills over and over again, which is why I'm happy to say that by the end of this year, I will have an online course available to educators all around the world about how to learn and teach moral courage in our polarized era. And what that means ultimately is that we are teaching our students to become, yes, what I call gutsy global citizens. And I want to emphasize the word gutsy, right? Many people assume that to be a global citizen today is to self-censor, to zip up your lip, to not say anything if you have questions or perhaps even disagreements about other cultures, about other traditions, about other customs, about other religions, because after all, we don't want to offend. But as a result, it takes guts to engage with people from different parts of the world about their values as much as about your own values. And if any conversation is going to be meaningful, it's got to be infused with questions that will make all of us a little bit uncomfortable. So gutsy global citizenship recognizes that how we progress as a human race is to ask questions of one another in order to understand. And in that way, we give ourselves a chance to grow. And guess what? We also give our so-called others a chance to grow.
Thank you, Irshad, and thank you for mentioning your online course. I was going to ask you about that, because I know it's on your website and educators can get involved in that. So it's glad to know that end of this year that is possible. So that is brilliant.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. So just linking to others, in your most recent book, you talk about the importance of offending yourself, and that's literally how chapter is written. So could you tell us more about that for the audience?
Absolutely. Sure. So that might sound really odd, right? Offending ourselves? Why would we want to do that? And what does that even mean? So let me put this into context and then explain it. We all are immersed in a lot of uncertainty these days. And uncertainty is a form of threat to the primal brain, where, as I mentioned earlier, the ego comes from. And the ego is there to protect us from feeling threatened, which is why it will tell us what to do the moment we're feeling threatened, right? The problem here is, Ruby, that the ego was great and is great in a life and death situation. But even in the midst of a pandemic, most of us are not, minute by minute by minute in a life and death situation. But the ego cannot tell the difference between mortal danger and mere discomfort. And that is what we feel when we are being disagreed with, mere discomfort. So it's very easy to become dogmatic about our point of view whenever we are questioned or challenged, because the ego is telling us your humanity is being questioned. Your existence is being questioned. You are facing an existential threat. And the technologies that we use today, particularly those of social media, are deliberately designed to amplify these emotions. That's how they get us addicted to them. So, we have to learn how to manage this within ourselves. What this means is, when we are being told, you're wrong, and we want to fight back, it is much more effective and sanity-inducing to offend ourselves. Here's what I mean. While it's important to stand up for ourselves, often it's even more important to stand up to ourselves, to our egos. And that means openly, and if possibly out loud, so that you can hear your own voice saying this, acknowledging that somebody with whom I profoundly disagree has a kernel of wisdom to teach me. In my latest book, Don't Label Me, I tell stories. She is a veritable library, this one.
Yeah.
And Ruby, if the teaching profession doesn't work out for you, I think I know who I need to hire as my agent. Having said that, we need to acknowledge, right, that people who disagree with me profoundly have something to teach me. And in turn, when we can treat our other as a teacher, watch how over time they begin to treat us as their teacher. All of this leads to one ironclad law of human psychology. And it is this. It's a non-negotiable law. If you wish to be heard, you must first be willing to hear. Without doing that, all that you will achieve is planting the seeds of backlash, as I did early on when I, came in fist clenched, metaphorically, but fist clenched, ready to do battle with my fellow Muslims. And it was only when I started listening to them, including the ones who did not want to see me succeed. It was when I started listening to them that they began listening to me. Counterintuitive, but so very real.
Yeah, what I think that really stands out about the philosophy of moral courage is the idea that you first stand up to yourself. And for those who haven't read Irshad Manji's books yet, a lot of times it's easy to kind of scapegoat and say, oh, that's just someone who's trying to kind of fit in with the Western world, or the kind of criticisms that you often hear, or
right.
just trying to make a name for themselves. But what you find in Irshad's work, which those who win the books will know, is that first Irshad questions herself. She stands up to herself. She reflects on her own experiences and where she goes wrong, and she's open about it. Okay, and it's not just standing up to yourself and keeping it to yourself, but being open about it. And I think that's something really important, and something that I would emphasize in the classroom is that when we have when you question, when you want to learn, you first begin with yourself before you start with others. But yeah, so just kind of moving on. So we talked about a lot of theory. What advice would you have for teachers? So moral courage is brilliant when you say it in words, but what advice would you have for teachers in ensuring that we can be part of this and practice it?
Right. So as I mentioned, the online course, which will be ready, inshallah, God willing, by the end of this year, it's entitled Learning and Teaching Moral Courage. In other words, the teachers who will be taking this online course will first be learning it. And then, as part of the course, I will also be teaching how to teach it to others. So, you know, educators need not worry. There is absolutely no, you know, preconceived qualifications that you need. You need the intrinsic spark within you that wants to be able to both practice moral courage and therefore role model it for your students, and then teach it to a new generation, so that they don't lapse into the same stale mistakes that my generation has made, which is to impose solutions on people who disagree with those solutions. Think, aha, victory, we've, you know, been able to get that policy passed, or we've been able to get that law enacted, only to find that that victory is very temporary, because when the other side has power, they will undo it, precisely because they were not heard and included the first time around, which is frankly very much what we're experiencing here in the United States. So you see, right, that the stakes are high. You know, so many of the issues that our students will be having to provide solutions for, and enduring solutions for, are existential now. They're not just global challenges, they're existential challenges, from the climate crisis to, in America, homegrown terrorism, to mass migration, poverty, the politicizing of public health pandemics. All the more reason, I say, that we need to be teaching them how to communicate across lines of disagreement in order to get to the sustainable solutions, rather than just the, you know, the illusory ones. And as far as, you know, other tips go, Ruby, certainly I have at the end of Don't Label Me, a chapter called Honest Diversity, Step by Step. And by honest diversity, fellow educators, what I mean is diversity that doesn't just fixate on skin color and religion or gender and sexual orientation. Those are all external markers. Honest diversity incorporates diversity of viewpoint, because not all Muslims think alike, as you have, you know, really, as has really been affirmed during this conversation, right? Not all white people think the same. Not, you know, not all socialists or capitalists or feminists have exactly the same opinion on a range of issues. So if we're really interested in diversity, we also have to ask people who share the same label what they think on any given issue, and not just assume that because we've assigned them a particular label, or they've taken it for themselves, that we now know everything that there is to know about them. So at the end of Don't Label Me, there is a chapter with 11 concrete tips for how to start and sustain you know, constructive conversations that involve disagreement. And for those who are interested, I'm happy to say that as of next week, there will also be a discussion guide that I'll be posting on my website. So Ruby, I'll make sure that you have the link to it that you can then pass on to the attendees here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Irshad, for that. For, you know, I think the main message of Don't Label Me is the idea that we are multifaceted people. We have different dimensions. We are not just one label. Often labels change, labels develop, and that's what it is to be human. We progress. So I'd just like to say a very, very big thank you for joining us. I think our time has come to an end, but if there are any questions, you can ask. But I'd just like to say this has been the greatest honor of my life.
Oh, Ruby.
Higher than this, I am happy. This is everything. Thank you so much.
Can I just say that for me, you are a true inspiration. I don't say this, no, really, I don't say this, you know, as a throwaway line. Remember, it's young Muslims and young people like you who are the reason I get out of bed every morning. For all of the negativity that our world throws at us, ladies and gentlemen, the Rubies of this world show that progress is possible. And indeed, it's necessary. So please continue your good work. As I say to all of the educators in this forum, continue with your good work. And we will empower and equip a new generation to take this planet where it needs to go.
Thank you so much.